Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Drawing Commentary. This episode is going to be a little bit more lighthearted and whimsical. It depicts a small promotional, kind of self-promotional piece that I did that is about my webcomic, which is called Mindfold, and one of the hosting sites that hosts Mindfold does this annual kind of fun contest where people just vote on their favorite comics. So this is sort of like a promotional calling people's attention to Mindfold on that site, and it features the characters in the comic, but in a very kind of ridiculous, absurd situation featuring pirate monkeys and stuff like that. And it's also done in a much more cartoony and exaggerated style. And I'm only going to do 2 of the 4 panels. A lot of comic panels are quite similar to each other, so there's no point in me rendering out all 4 of them. I'm just going to do the 2nd and the 4th one to give an idea of some of the coloring techniques that I'm doing. And as you can see, the line work was done in pen and ink on paper and then scanned, so that's just a physical process that I can't record. And then the figures in the foreground have just been put on a separate layer of their own, and the transparency of that layer is locked, so I can just freely scribble all over those figures and not worry about my brush strokes. And then I can do the same, get very loose and sloppy with the background colors, and they're not going to interfere with the figures. So first thing I'm doing is I've just rendered that mechanical bronze ape submarine that is coming out of the water and threatening our characters who are sitting on this little tropical island. And I'm putting in the water. You can see I started with a photograph that I just pulled off the internet. It doesn't really matter too much what that photograph looks like because I'm just using it to pick colors and sort of give myself a general texture. And you can see I'm painting on top of it, and I'm indicating both the reflectivity of the water, so things that are more like mirrored in the waves, and also things that can be seen through the water, through the transparency of the water. You can see in that island that's in the foreground, there's part of the sandy shore of that island is still visible through the water, whereas the ape submarine is completely a reflected entity in the water. The reason I'm mentioning that is because some parts of water are reflective and some parts of water are transparent. And the parts of water that are transparent in this case are going to be what is close to you, when you're looking right down into the waves that are below you, whereas water that's closer to the horizon is going to be reflective and not transparent. And the reason for that is the Fresnel effect. And the Fresnel effect is like a physics thing that's very specific and quite detailed, and I'm not going to go into that. Essentially, objects that are more parallel to your line of sight are going to be reflective, whereas surfaces that are more perpendicular to your line of sight will not be reflective, and so water will be more transparent as it's closer to the foreground. And I admit completely that's a very crude and not terribly accurate interpretation or description of the Fresnel effect, again, because I'm doing it very crudely in this drawing, but it's something you should think about if you're rendering in a somewhat kind of realistic way of look into the Fresnel effect for rendering. reflective surfaces, and in reality, everything is reflective to some extent. Even like cardboard or an asphalt street, it still has reflective properties if you're really being faithful to the physics of light in the real world. Let me get back to what I'm doing right now in the video. I'm rendering that submarine as bronze, and the way I'm getting those really loud metallic highlights on there is I'm going over it with the brush, and the blend mode of the brush is set to color dodge, and that's a really nice, quick and dirty way to create the illusion of a metallic material. And the important word to remember there is illusion. In the real world, in physics, the way that metallic effects happen are very different from what the color dodge blend mode is doing in Photoshop. But if you use it wisely, you can sort of use color dodge to get a really quick and fake sort of metallic look. And generally, color dodge can be used to fake in a very quick and dirty effect of bright sunlight hitting a surface. But it's very easy to overuse the color dodge blend mode. So use caution when you proceed that way. Also, the sky background that I put in is just a watercolor wash on a piece of watercolor paper that I scanned in and then just slapped right into the background. And on the other panels, I think I use exactly that same texture. The nature of comic books is that a lot of times panels will have very similar content in it, so it's not really important to get a unique sky every time. That would take too much time. You can see now I've moved on to the last panel. This one is a little bit more complicated for two reasons. One, because there's a whole lot more going on here. There's a lot of objects, and also two, it's underwater, and generally the effects of water can create a lot more complicated things going on because there's haze suspended in the water, transparency falls off more quickly, light is very much filtered by the water, so everything is a little bit more bluish, and so that all has to be accounted for. The other thing I should mention also is, since I said this drawing took longer, I should just mention that I would say the total drawing time of this panel was maybe an hour and 15 minutes, and the previous panel, I think from rough pencil sketch all the way through finished coloring, was about 45 minutes. So the reason I'm using this very cartoony, very caricature-y style is because I can really bang out art very quickly, and the audience is very comfortable with suspending disbelief. They know that the proportions of the figures and even just the absurd content is not real, and so a lot of just very sketchy and loose gestural things are accepted quite easily. The actual comic book Mindfold is rendered in a much more photorealistic style, so I can't take a lot of these quick and dirty shortcuts, and black and white line work is much more subdued in the actual comic book. The black and white line work is very helpful because it defines objects and edges immediately, and the the viewer can see exactly where one object ends and the next one begins, which is great for a cartoon. But if you're going for a more photorealistic look, that those dark edges are going to just one, they're going to make the image look clearly like a drawing and not like a photograph, and two, those black lines can very easily flatten an image because an object that's way in the background, like that ape submarine, has exactly the same thickness of line as the figures in the foreground, so that just it destroys the illusion of depth. And you'll see later on in the video that I actually add another layer that starts to obscure some of the line work, so it really creates this sense of underwater haze and underwater depth. What I'm doing right here in the immediate process is I'm just adding a lot of very rough texture, and I'm using a lot of photographs that I just pulled right off the internet. If you do like a photo collage and those photographs are really clearly recognizable and clearly discernible, you can't really do that. You can't just take someone else's photograph and sort of stick it into your artwork and call it your own. But I'm layering a lot of these at maybe 10% opacity, or using like a soft light blend mode to just sort of give this vaguely appropriate hint of a pebbly texture that somehow looks like it should be an underwater thing, but you can't really discern what it actually is. So at the end of it, the original photograph is completely unrecognizable. It's just sort of as a quick way of not having to scribble all that stuff by hand. And you can see right now, like on the figures, that one, I started out with a green base color for all the figures, and two, that flesh tone is a lot more in the greens and yellows than what you would actually expect for human skin. And that goes back to what I'm saying, where the water will filter light and make everything into a more bluish cast. And so I want to create that effect to some extent so that things look underwater. But again, since this is a cartoon, I'm also cheating. I went back in with my faithful color dodge blend mode brush and hit the figure on the left with a little bit of bright light, which is probably brighter than what you'd actually see in an underwater scene. But I want that figure to really come into the foreground, because one thing with any illustration, but especially with a cartoony comic booky thing, is you want to have a very immediate sense of which object is important and which object is not. And in this case, the figures are also going to have like voice balloons. They're talking to each other, but you want to make it very clear that the figures are the subject of the composition. And so I've added just a little bit of extra bright light to really make them jump forward. Another place where I use that color dodge blend mode on my brush is in rendering the caustic effects of the waves above. You can see that on the side of that sunken ship, and you can also see that On the sand below, there are those sort of squiggly zebra stripes of bright light, which is called a caustic refraction of the light getting scattered through the water by the waves above. So that's another place where I can quickly just sort of give a bright light without really having to labor it too hard. So yeah, coming back to the immediate rendering techniques, you can see with the treasure chest, it should be pretty light, it should be pretty dark in there, but there's still reflected light hitting the interior of that treasure chest lid, just to render out some more of the play of light. And unfortunately, my computer crashed, so I lost some of the recording. So you can see I've already added in some of those color shafts, and I've added in that hazy background that really creates more of the watery effect, and also serves to really push the two figures out into the foreground and make everything else recede. And the way that everything is receding is because that haze is on a layer that's on top of my black and white line work. So that black and white line work is starting to get obscured a little bit, and it's flattening my image less than if the line work were right on top of everything, which clearly doesn't correspond to physical media, because if I were doing this, let's say in watercolor, that black ink is going to be on top and I can't ever change it. But in Photoshop, I can start to add other colors in an opaque fashion that obscure things in a way that would be very hard to do in physical media. And also just another thing I did, like with those pearls and those bubbles, those were just custom brushes. I just made like a bubble-like shape and a pearl-like shape, converted that into a brush, and then just tapped it around. Again, it's that's sort of what any sane person does in Photoshop, is like, how can I make the program do as much grunt work for me as possible, rather than having to render out all of those pearls and everything individually. I'm pretty close to the end of this now. I'm just doing some noodling, and there's the completed second panel. I pretty much just added a few little noodling details here and there. Those are the different layers turning on and off, and then I also just added the voice balloons and the text. So that's sort of what the final piece looked like. And then the other panel also, this one had a lot more layers because, like I said, I put a lot of opaque colors on top of the line work. So it got a little more complicated. And again, then I just added the voice balloons and the text, and that was pretty much it. So yeah, I think the entire finished page took maybe 6 hours altogether, so that's 4 panels. So it's a pretty good style for just cranking out artwork on a very short time frame. And I hope you found some helpful tips in this video, and I will talk to you again sometime soon. All right, take care.